The air in the sea cave on the remote coast of Easter Island was cool, damp and heavy, with the scent of salt and ancient stone, and something else, something indefinable, like the faint echo of a song sung in languages that predated all human tongues, a melody that seemed to vibrate through the volcanic rock, as if the earth itself was remembering a civilization that had vanished beneath the waves. A single shaft of moonlight filtered through a natural aperture aligned with celestial precision to catch the light of certain stars, visible only from the southern hemisphere, illuminated a series of carvings on the cave wall that bore no resemblance to the famous Moai statues above, but seemed far older, rendered in a style that suggested they had been made before the island existed, before the ocean had risen to cover the lands that had once connected this isolated place to a greater whole. The carvings depicted women with marks on their foreheads that resembled the third eye of Eastern mysticism, their hands raised in gestures that seemed to be both blessing and command, and around them, emerging from them, flowing through them, were dragons, whose forms merged seamlessly with waves, with fire, with the spiraling patterns that modern science would recognize as DNA helices and ancient wisdom had always known as the coiled serpent of transformation. At the base of the carvings, symbols in a script that predated cuneiform, that predated hieroglyphs, that seemed to be the mother tongue from which all later writing descended, formed words that a voice in my consciousness translated without my conscious understanding. When the motherland fell beneath the waters, when Lemuria was lost and the dragon temples were consumed by the rising seas, the daughters who had been initiated into the deepest mysteries did not perish, but scattered to the 7 directions, carrying with them the seeds of the ancient wisdom, planting them in the new lands that would become the cradles of later civilizations, ensuring that what had been learned in Lemuria would not be lost, but would sleep in the collective memory, waiting for the time when humanity would be ready to remember. What if Lemuria, the mythical continent that esoteric traditions place in the Pacific before Atlantis, before recorded history, was not merely legend, but the memory of an actual civilization whose fall gave birth to the mystery schools that would later appear in Egypt, India, China, and Mesoamerica? And what if the keepers of its highest teachings were not priests or kings, but women called the Dragon Daughters, initiates who had mastered the serpent power within, who understood consciousness and energy in ways our science is only beginning to glimpse? And what if these women, fleeing the cataclysm that destroyed their homeland, became the hidden founders of every spiritual tradition that honors the divine feminine, the coiled serpent, and the transformation of human consciousness into something divine? What timeless secret did these impossible carvings preserve, and what profound revelation awaited the one who dared to remember Lemuria not as New Age fantasy, but as the source, civilization from which all later wisdom traditions descended, to perceive the delicate threads connecting the dragon daughters of the sunken continent to every goddess cult, every serpent mystery, every teaching about kundalini or chi, or the ascent of consciousness through the body's energy centers. My name is Lyra, and the call to something beyond had been a persistent vibration in my consciousness since childhood, when I would have dreams so vivid they felt like memories of a life I had never lived, in a land that no longer existed, dreams where I walked on a continent in the Pacific where the climate was eternal spring, where massive crystals grew from the earth and were used not for ornamentation but as tools of consciousness, where human beings lived in such harmony with the natural world and with each other that war was unknown and hierarchy was unnecessary, because telepathy made deception impossible and everyone could perceive the truth of what another felt and intended. In these dreams, I was always one of the dragon daughters, women who had undergone initiations that awakened the serpent fire within, who could heal with a touch, who could communicate across vast distances, who served as bridges between the physical and spiritual realms, between the human and the more than human, The dreams always ended the same way, with the feeling of the earth moving, of waters rising, of knowing that everything we had built was about to be destroyed, and of making the desperate choice to flee, carrying with us what could be carried, the seeds and the knowledge, trusting that they could be planted in new soil, even as our hearts broke for all that would be lost. These dreams left me shaking, desperate to understand if they were mere fantasy or some kind of cellular memory, genetic knowledge passed down through bloodlines from actual ancestors who had lived through actual catastrophe. My journey to understanding began not with esoteric texts, but with science, with my doctoral research in comparative mythology and archaeogenetics, where I discovered patterns that conventional academic explanations could not adequately address. The appearance of advanced agricultural knowledge, astronomical understanding, and spiritual symbolism in multiple locations around the Pacific Rim at roughly the same time period, approximately 12,000 years ago, following catastrophic climate changes and sea level rise that the geological record confirmed, but that had no survivors to record in written history. Because writing as we know it did not yet exist, I found legends across Polynesia, in Aboriginal Australia, in coastal India, in Indonesia, in the Americas, all speaking of lands that had been swallowed by the ocean, of ancestors who had come from those sunken places bringing knowledge and culture to the survivors of the cataclysm. The path that followed these discoveries was not one of comfortable academic analysis, but an all-consuming quest that took me to remote locations across the Pacific, to sacred sites that locals said had been there since before the waters rose, to oral histories preserved by indigenous peoples who insisted their ancestors had come from a great land in the ocean that no longer existed. In Rapa Nui, in Hawaii, in New Zealand, in dozens of smaller islands, I found traces of what seemed to be a common source culture, symbols and practices that suggested connection to something older than any of the known civilizations, something that had been already ancient when Egypt was young. Each discovery brought resistance, both internal and external. There was the academic establishment that dismissed Lemuria as 19th century occult nonsense, insisting that any similarities between Pacific cultures were due to later migration and diffusion, not inheritance from a common mother civilization that predated them all. There was my own scientific training that demanded hard evidence, physical proof, things that are difficult to find when the supposed civilization lies at the bottom of the ocean and its refugees would have been focused on survival, not on preserving artifacts. There was the painful recognition that if Lemuria had existed and fallen, if the dragon daughters had been real, then the dreams I was having might not be imagination, but actual memory, which raised terrifying questions about consciousness, reincarnation, and the possibility that we carry in our very cells the experiences of ancestors or previous lives. Yet there were also unexpected validations, moments when the research led to something that could not be easily explained away. A genetic study showing unusual markers in certain Pacific Island populations that suggested ancestry from a now submerged landmass. Underwater archaeological surveys revealing what appeared to be artificial structures at depths that would only make sense if they had been built during the last ice age, when sea levels were dramatically lower. And most compellingly, the testimony of wisdom keepers from traditions that had preserved oral histories for thousands of years, who insisted that their knowledge came from the dragon mothers, the women who had fled the sinking land and had taught the survivors how to live, how to grow food, how to track the stars, how to awaken the serpent power within. It was an elderly kahuna in Hawaii who finally told me about the cave, a place that her grandmother had shown her, that held carvings made by the first dragon daughters who had reached the islands. Carvings that told the story of Lemuria's fall and the mission they had carried forward. She said, "Our people remember. The land that was swallowed was called many names, but we called it the motherland. the place where the first humans learned to be truly human, where the dragon mothers taught us that we are not just flesh but spirit, that within each body lies the coiled serpent that can rise and make us divine. When the earth shook and the waters came, the dragon mothers knew what was happening. They had foreseen it. They gathered those who could be saved, and they scattered across the ocean, each group carrying seeds of the knowledge, planting it in the new lands. They are why every culture that touches the Pacific has stories of a great flood, of lands that sank, of ancestors who came from the sea bringing wisdom. They are why we honor the serpent, why we know about the energy that rises through the spine, why we remember that women are the primary carriers of the sacred, because they birth life and they can birth consciousness. The cave is sacred. Not many are shown it, but you have been dreaming the memories you are ready to remember. The journey to the cave required days of preparation, rituals of purification that the kahuna insisted upon, meditations to prepare my consciousness for what I would encounter. When we finally entered the sea cave on a night when the moon and stars aligned as they had not aligned in generations, when I saw the carvings illuminated by that celestial light, something broke open in my consciousness, and I was no longer merely Lyra the researcher, but a vessel through which the memories of the dragon daughters flowed. I experienced Lemuria not as myth or metaphor, but as lived reality, feeling in my body what it had been like to walk that land, to study in the dragon temples where the deepest mysteries were taught, to undergo the initiations that awakened the serpent power and opened the channels of consciousness that most humans never access. I saw that Lemuria had not been technologically advanced in the ways we typically imagine, not computers and machines, but rather that they had developed the technology of consciousness to heights we cannot imagine, understanding how to work directly with energy, with thought, with intention to shape reality in ways that would seem like magic to modern eyes. The Dragon Daughters were not a separate caste, but represented a stage of development that many achieved, women who had fully awakened the Kundalini, whose third eyes were permanently open, who could perceive multiple dimensions simultaneously, who served as healers, teachers, and mediators between realms. I experienced the catastrophe from their perspective, the horror of watching the earth convulse, of feeling the continent beginning to sink, of knowing that thousands of years of accumulated wisdom were about to be lost. But I also experienced their response, not despair but determination, the gathering of those who could be saved, the decision about what to preserve. They could not save the buildings, could not save the crystals, could not save most of the population. But they could save the knowledge, could save the practices, could save the seeds, both literal and metaphorical. They could scatter across the ocean to the lands that the cataclysm had reshaped, and they could plant what they carried, trusting that future generations would tend those seeds, and that someday when humanity was ready, the flowers would bloom again. I witnessed the scattering, felt the grief of dragon daughters, saying farewell to sisters they would never see again, each group taking a portion of the teaching to preserve in isolation, knowing that the full knowledge would only be reconstructed when all the fragments were eventually brought back together. Some went west to India and Southeast Asia, carrying the teachings that would become Tantra and the understanding of chakras and Kundalini. Some went east to the Americas, carrying the teachings that would become the feathered serpent mysteries of Mesoamerica. Some went north to what would become China and Japan, carrying the teachings about Qi and the energy meridians. Some went south to Australia and New Zealand, carrying the teachings about dreamtime and the serpent tracks across the land. And everywhere they went, they planted the same core understanding, that humans are not just physical beings, but spiritual ones, that consciousness can be cultivated and transformed, that the serpent power lies coiled at the base of the spine, waiting to be awakened, that women are primary carriers of this potential because the energy pathways in the female body naturally spiral as the dragon spirals, and that awakening this power is not individual achievement, but service to the evolution of all. Consciousness, if you want a practical step-by-step explanation of the path of knowledge we're exploring here today, I've created a complete guide to help you apply it in your own life. You'll find the link in the description. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to know. When the vision finally released me and I found myself back in the cave, collapsed on the stone floor, my body still trembling with the energy of what I had experienced, I understood why the memory of Lemuria had been preserved not in history books, but in esoteric traditions, in myths and dreams, and the cellular memory of those whose ancestors had been there or whose souls had incarnated from there. The fall of Lemuria had not been the end, but the diaspora, the spreading of the teachings across the globe, ensuring that what had been concentrated in one place would be distributed everywhere, hidden in plain sight, woven into the foundation of every culture that remembered the divine feminine, the sacred serpent, and the transformation of consciousness. I understood that the dragon daughters had succeeded in their mission, that the seeds they planted had grown into the mystery schools of Egypt, the tantric traditions of India, the Taoist alchemy of China, the vision quests of the Americas, all of them preserving fragments of the Lemurian gnosis adapted to their specific cultural contexts, but retaining the core understanding that humans are meant to evolve, that consciousness can awaken, that the serpent is teacher, not tempter, and that women are crucial carriers of this transformative knowledge. The weeks that followed were of profound integration and silence. I remained on the island, spending my days in meditation and contemplation, allowing the memories to settle, distinguishing what was personal vision from what was collective memory, from what was perhaps past life recall. I came to understand that whether Lemuria was historically real in the exact way I had experienced it, or whether it was the mythological encoding of actual knowledge about human consciousness and its evolution, the truth it pointed toward was valid and vital. That humanity has forgotten something essential about its own nature and potential, that this forgetting has caused immense suffering, and that the remembering is not just possible, but necessary for our survival and evolution as a species. My emergence from that contemplative period was with clarity about my purpose. I would not try to prove Lemuria's existence to academic skeptics who required physical evidence that the ocean had long ago consumed. Instead, I would share the teachings the dragon daughters had preserved, would present them not as ancient history that may or may not be literally true, but as living wisdom that works regardless of its origin story, would help modern seekers reconnect with the practices that awaken the serpent power, open the energy centers, and facilitate the transformation of consciousness that the dragon daughters had mastered and had worked so hard to preserve through the catastrophe. I began writing, creating a comprehensive text I called "When Lemuria Fell, the Dragon Daughters Rose, Recovering the Ancient Feminine Path of Consciousness Transformation." In it, I presented the evidence for a Pacific source civilization, the patterns in mythology and genetics and linguistics that suggested connection to a common origin now submerged, but I focused primarily on the teachings themselves. The practices for awakening Kundalini safely, the understanding of the body's energy system, the cultivation of psychic and healing abilities, the path of transformation that the dragon daughters had walked and had encoded in the mystery traditions they founded. After the fall, I taught that whether one believed in Lemuria literally or symbolically, the wisdom attributed to the dragon daughters was practical and applicable, offering methods for working with consciousness and energy that produced measurable results in those who practiced them with dedication and respect. I created workshops and retreats where I taught what I called the Dragon Daughter practices, techniques for breath and movement and visualization that I had learned partly from studying various traditions and partly from the vision in the cave. Methods that participants reported produced experiences of energy awakening, of consciousness expansion, of reconnection to something ancient and powerful that they felt they were remembering rather than learning for the first time. I gathered students who felt the same call I had felt, who resonated with the image of the dragon daughters fleeing the cataclysm to preserve the wisdom, who understood themselves as carriers of that lineage, whether through literal genetics or spiritual affinity, who committed to doing the work of preservation and transmission in our own time of potential catastrophe and necessary transformation. And I connected with wisdom keepers from the various traditions that I believed carried Lemurian fragments, bringing together practitioners of Kundalini yoga and Taoist energy work, and Hawaiian huna and Aboriginal dreamtime practices, finding that when we shared our knowledge, patterns emerged, correspondences that suggested we were indeed all working with pieces of a greater whole that had been scattered but could be reassembled. My final work in this phase was to return to the cave one last time, bringing with me a circle of advanced practitioners, women who had trained in the dragon daughter practices and who were ready to take on the mantle of preservation and transmission in their own right. We gathered on a night when the celestial alignment once again illuminated the ancient carvings, and I led them through a ritual that combined elements from all the traditions I had studied, a ceremony of remembrance and recommitment. Standing in that sacred space with the carvings of the original dragon daughters watching over us, I spoke aloud what we had all come to know. Lemuria fell, but the dragon daughters rose. When the motherland was lost, when the temples were consumed by the sea, when everything physical was destroyed, the knowledge survived because it was never dependent on place or structure, but was written in consciousness itself, encoded in practices that could be taught anywhere, carried in the bodies and awareness of those who had awakened. The dragon daughters scattered not in defeat, but in strategy, planting seeds of the wisdom across the globe, trusting that future generations would tend those seeds and that the flowers would bloom again when the time was right. That time is now. We stand at another threshold, another potential cataclysm, another moment when the old world is ending and a new one must be born. We who carry the lineage of the dragon daughters, whether through blood or through soul affinity, are called to do what they did, to preserve the essential wisdom, to plant it everywhere, to ensure that what is true and vital about human spiritual potential does not perish, but transforms and adapts and continues. The serpent power is real. The energy centers are real. The transformation of consciousness is possible. Women are primary carriers of this knowledge because the pathways are written in our bodies, because we birth life and we can birth awakening. We honor the dragon daughters not through worship, but through continuation of their work. We remember Lemuria not as lost paradise to mourn, but as seed time whose harvest is now. When the motherland fell, the daughters rose and scattered the wisdom to the 7 directions. Now the daughters must rise again and bring the scattered wisdom back together, weaving the fragments into a whole that serves not just individual awakening, but collective transformation, not just remembering what was, but creating what can be. And as I spoke, all of us in that circle felt it, unmistakable and undeniable, the presence of the dragon daughters themselves, not as ghosts from the distant past, but as living patterns in the consciousness field, recognizing themselves in us, their mission continuing through our work, their wisdom flowering in forms they could not have imagined, but would surely recognize as continuation of what they began when they fled the sinking land carrying seeds they trusted would someday grow. And if you liked this story, you will definitely love the next one that's appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like, and activate the notifications. See you in the next one.